Hello again. In late 1884, a rather amazing event, or was it, began to unfold in Berlin. Representatives of a number of Western powers, invited by Chancellor Bismarck, began to discuss what we might call the ground rules for the approaching partition and foreign occupation of Africa by themselves. Not surprisingly, perhaps, not an African was present. And also not surprisingly, the Berlin Conference, which stretched into the early weeks of 1885, is often seen as the starting gun, if you will, for the scramble for Africa, and therefore for Africa's colonial period. In the last lecture, we spoke of the winds of change and the way they were blowing in the 19th century interlude between the ending of the Atlantic slave trade and the onset of the colonial era. What were gentle breezes early in that century had become, by the 1880s, a full-force gale. In the space of a single generation, almost every bit of Africa was colonized by one or another European power. Let me hasten to add, however, that as empires go, these empires were not particularly long-lasting. And again, for most, not all, but for most of Africa, only 3 or 4 generations later, and equally quickly, within the space of a single generation, decolonization occurred in Africa as well. Now, this may be a good time to sharpen our terminology somewhat. The terms imperialism and colonialism are often used interchangeably, and often there's no problem with that. I am, however, in a moment going to propose an analytical distinction which I hope is helpful. It's also true that imperialism and colonialism are highly emotive words for good reason. In our own time, they're probably most often used as epithets of some sort or another. Again, I'm going to propose a sort of cooled off pair of definitions here to try to get at colonialism, but they should be emotive words. After all, these words in modern history that end in ISM often do pack a lot of punch. I mean, when you start down the list of capitalism, socialism, communism, fascism, Nazism, sexism, racism, imperialism, colonialism, you know, you're marching through a lot of the great categories and a lot of the great dynamics which have driven the history of the world in the last few centuries. So, back to my treatment of imperialism and colonialism. I will suggest that we use imperialism to refer, quite simply, to the power or influence exerted by more powerful nations over less powerful ones. Let me concede at the outset, then, that in theory, and indeed sometimes in reality, that imperialism, as I've just defined it, can have a benign and indeed perhaps a positive impact. At the moment when the Rwanda genocide was unfolding in 1994, had Western powers, for instance, intervened, it is probably true to say that a great many lives might have been saved. I cannot look on that as other than a positive impact. I can also assure you that some voices, including those who were later critical of the failure of the move in the early stages, would have been critical and would have referred to this as imperialist interference in Rwanda had it occurred. Again, power or influence exerted from the more powerful nations towards the less powerful. What I'm trying to get at is the direction of the flow of this power and influence. Now, with my extremely broad definition, what advantage it gives to me is that you can then identify a whole range across a spectrum of kinds or styles or flavors of imperialism. kinds of influence or power exerted by more powerful countries vis-a-vis less powerful ones. For instance, if we start at sort of the mild side of the imperialism spectrum, if you like, we could talk about something we might refer to as cultural imperialism. I don't simply mean the missionary enterprise, for instance, that we have been looking at. We'll look at some more in this case. In today's world, the fact that if you turn on a TV or go to a movie theater in Nairobi or Lagos or Harare or Lusaka, you're going to see products which more than likely are produced in Hollywood or some other Western country. Now, that may be for good or ill, depending on your perspective, but it does fit my definition of cultural imperialism in this sort of cooled-off sense, where the influence is coming from, where it is going to and being exerted. Let's move across the spectrum a bit more. We can imagine something we might call economic imperialism, for instance. If a small country in, say, Central America is very heavily dependent upon the production of one product, like bananas, let us say, and essentially has one market represented for many years at least by one great firm, and I'm thinking of the market in El Norte, the North American market, I don't think it's far-fetched to suggest that this represents a very considerable influence and power exerted in an economic sphere from the powerful towards the less powerful. Now, let's continue moving along our spectrum from milder to more direct forms of power or influence exerted. We're all familiar with situations sometimes referred to as countries where somebody or another is called, usually intended to be an epithet again, a puppet or a puppet government. What I'm getting at is that we all know of situations where a leader in power, for instance, is certainly a citizen of the smaller and less powerful country, but we would be foolish not to recognize that there are external powers that are, in a sense, pulling the strings. That's where the term puppet ruler comes from. That there are powers behind the scene, whether it's the Soviet Union, behind the scene in the old regime in Afghanistan, which preceded the Taliban, or the U.S. behind Somoza in a place like Nicaragua, or what have you. Now, if we continue across this spectrum to, in my view, the end of the most direct, we come to the most direct form of imperialism. And here, that end of the spectrum is what I would reserve for my use of the term colonialism. In other words, colonialism is not simply indirect or cultural or economic in its form. It is direct. It is upfront. It is formalized takeover. In the last analysis, the bottom line, if you like, of colonial situations, but not of the other imperial situations I've been talking about, the bottom line is either real or implied conquest, either warfare resulting in conquest or some sort of preemptive acknowledgement or surrender based on the inevitability of physical conquest, of military conquest. It is not just imperialism, then, that befell Africa at the end of the 19th century and lasted through much of the 20th century. It is, of course, this last instance. It is colonial rule. It is the outright and direct partitioning, occupation, rebordering of the continent by various European powers, French, British, German, Portuguese, Belgian, and so on. Before that colonial period, we can speak of outside imperialism of other sorts. After it, a lot of people, after the colonial period has ended, a lot of people would speak of imperialism as I've defined it, going on in Africa, but rarely colonialism until we reach this late 19th, early 20th century. Important exceptions to that, and we've looked at one, and that certainly was an exception in the case of the Cape Colony of South Africa. Now, in my view, for major actions to occur in life, maybe even for minor actions to occur in life and in history, the protagonist who would carry out such an action must possess both the motivation and the capability to carry out the action. Or else it's not, one without the other is not sufficient. Again, if I can be sort of silly about this, for me to make the journey to the grocery store and get some food, I have to want to make that journey, feeling that I need to or have to or desire to, but I have to have the means to get there and back. I have to have the motivation and the capability. On a more serious level, for European powers to carry out the conquest of this enormous continent, they had to have the motivation to do so and the capacity to do so, the capability to do so. Again, one without the other, and the action does not, in fact, materialize. Now, in addition to those two, we usually find, and I think this is true both, again, in our personal lives, perhaps, and in historical events or actions, such as the conquest of Africa. Motivation is there, capability is there, and what's also usually there is the justification for the action, the rationalization of the action, the convincing of the protagonist's self that the action is justified and, in fact, should be carried out. Let us examine then briefly what it is that, what range of factors gave Western European powers, after centuries of contact in various ways, after all, with Africa, certainly with much of Africa through the Atlantic slave trade and so forth, what was the range of factors which converged at this particular period of time to provide the motivation, the capability, and indeed the rationalization to partition the continent and add various portions to the European empires? Again, it's like explaining why people migrated to the mines and cities of Southern Africa. I don't think there's one single explanation for this. It's a combination of factors which, again, coalesce at a particular period and produce this dramatic transformation. Now, a good starting point, again, is the Industrial Revolution, which is reaching a kind of maturation at this point. It's certainly in full swing at this period of time. If, as I suggested earlier, a good symbol of the preceding age of mercantile capitalism was the sailing ship, then a good symbol for the industrial age, it would seem, would be, of course, the factory. One could also make a case for the railway, and I will make that case in a later lecture as it's extended to Africa. But if the factory is the symbol of the industrial age, there is certainly a huge perceived need to pursue new sources of raw materials for those factories and new markets for the output of those factories, that is, new consumers for the goods produced from originally raw materials into finished goods by the factories themselves. So a search for raw materials, a search and effort to tap new markets, new places, new customers for the enormously multiplying manufacturing capacity of places like Western Europe, or indeed the United States of America, is part of what is contributing to this energy at the end of the 19th century. Now, as we saw in the last lecture with our attention to David Livingstone, for instance, an evangelical revival is certainly underway in Europe at this time as well. Saving the heathen, as the phrase went, provided both motivation and justification for going into Africa, and in some people's mind, for going in force if necessary. A rather less charitable development was that which we might call pseudoscientific racism. From theories like social Darwinism, which, of course, as you know, attempted to apply the notion of survival of the fittest into social events, into historical analysis. It was a short leap from social Darwinism to the conclusion that Europeans, apparently so powerful after all, had a destiny to dominate the lesser races, perhaps above all the Africans. Now, both sides of this, in a sense, it can be captured by a poet I turned to last time, and he was the poet of empire, the poet laureate of Britain, for a long time, and of course a famous writer of children's books as well. And that's Rudyard Kipling. He wrote a poem published in 1900. I mean, the date is just about perfect for this, with a very revealing title, and it's a poem which seems to sum up both sides of this, both the kind of paternalist beneficence of bringing the benefits of Christianity and the civilizing mission, and meaning it quite sincerely, as well as the sort of harder side of this, the social Darwinist, what I've called a sort of a pseudoscientific racist dismissal of Africans. These are combined in sometimes complex ways in his poem, with the very revealing title of The White Man's Burden reveals this. You know, he doesn't call it the white man's chance. He doesn't say the white man's domination, the white man's burden to redeem this benighted part of the world. Just one verse. Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the best ye breed. Go, bind your sons in exile to serve your captives' need. Interesting phrase, serve your captives' needs, to wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Half devil, half child. Captures the flavor of both sides of this reaching out rather well, I think. And finally, when we talk about the capability to carry out something like the partition of Africa, it leads us, of course, to military capability. The astonishing technology of the industrial age had its military applications, perhaps most symbolically in the development of the first true machine gun, the Maxim gun, invented by an American inventor from Ohio, you know, like other inventions, who once said that his invention, the Maxim gun, bore the same relation to the common repeating rifle as the Singer sewing machine did to a hand-pulled needle, or the McCormick Reaper to a hand-held scythe or sickle. A quantum leap, in other words, in this case, of the ability to deliver lethality. It was this new weaponry, and the Maxim gun was proven. The laboratory for the efficacy, proving the efficacy of the Maxim gun, was Africa during this conquest. This finally gave Europe the decisive military advantage over African resistors. And another British poet of the time, Hilaire Belloc, sharply and humorously at the time, with his famous couplet, sums up that part of it. He simply said, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." Now, of course, all of this might not necessarily lead to outright colonization, to colonialism, as opposed to other forms of influence, had there not been multiple industrial powers involved in this scramble. But the dynamic of getting there first, and thus establishing not just tapping new markets, but establishing secure new markets, preserved new markets, of establishing secure sources of raw materials. This notion of we better get there or the French will beat us, we better get there before the French or the Germans will pour in, etc., and claim these kinds of advantages. This because, after all, capitalism is largely about competition, and these were competing capitalist powers. And this lent a kind of self-generating momentum, and of course contributes to the remarkable speed of the takeover overall. Now, we know enough by now to know that Africans, that is African peoples, African states, African leaders, did not react passively to these events. It's first of all important to simply observe that resistance, and I mean physical military resistance, was widespread across the entire continent of Africa. The fact that it proved to be futile in the shorter run does not necessarily mean that it was insignificant as an inspiration to later generations, and we'll see that in our look at resistance in the case of Southern Rhodesia and later called Zimbabwe. Now, having said that physical resistance was widespread, it's wrong, in my view, to just divide up African rulers, for instance, between so-called heroic resistors on one side and cowardly capitulators or collaborators on the other. It was far more complex than that. And nobody had the benefit of hindsight to know that an action taken today would have the implications that it would have a generation hence in the terms of an occupation that would prove to be relatively lasting. Some indeed allied with Europeans in order to gain a short-term advantage versus or vis-a-vis an old rival, or concluded, like Moshweshwe, as we saw in lecture 17, that further resistance was indeed a dead end, and therefore agree, perhaps reluctantly, to a so-called protectorate status. Let us now focus on two real people, real kings, as they lived through and faced the new realities of late 19th century. One is from West Africa, one from Southern Africa. In Lecture 10, we saw that the savanna belt of West Africa, called the Sudan there, the savanna belt has long been a site for classic examples of state building and empire building. The late 18th and 19th centuries in the Sudan saw new variations on that theme and a number of strong new states and empires. Some of them indeed built on the energy of Islamic revivalism and jihad, holy war, emerged in this area. This is when the northern Nigerian caliphates, for instance, which still exert a considerable influence in Nigerian affairs, were created as a result of Islamic jihads. One of the new empires appeared in the 1870s under the leadership of Samori Toure. Now, Toure had been born in 1830. He was a member of the so-called Jula, which is the Muslim merchant class in this Mande Malinke-dominated area of West Africa. He was born into that Muslim class. He was not, at least earlier in his life, especially demonstrative in his Islamic faith, and as we'll see, that came back to haunt him at a later time. He was better known for his extraordinary state building and military skills. As the French expanded eastward during the scramble from their base in Senegal, Samori actually recreated his empire several 100 miles to the east. This was actually an empire on the move, if you like. He left repeatedly the French what amounted to a scorched earth to occupy. By this time, he was tapping resources in British-held Sierra Leone to obtain firearms. And even after the British cut this off at a certain point, he put 300 to 400 of his own blacksmiths to work in making copies of the firearms he had. He'd set up what amounted to a small-scale arms factory here in the middle of West Africa. Samori also attempted something that not a great many did. He attempted to create an alliance between himself and some of the other powerful figures here to resist the European encroachment. He approached, in particular, Amadou Sékou, who was the son of one of these prophet figures who had created a empire which very much mixed the notion of Islam and commerce. Further west, he approached Amadou Sékou with these words: "If you continue to make war on your own, the whites will have no trouble defeating you. I've already undergone trying my strength against them. Let us therefore unite. You will hit the French from the north, I from the south. We will certainly manage to get rid of them." Now here's where a possible alliance foundered on questions of faith. Amadou wrote back and said, "The son of Al-Hajj Umar," a reference to his own father, "could not, without lowering himself, accept an alliance with or the assistance of an adventurer." The alliance was not concluded, and both of them eventually had to face the French alone. Eventually, the French caught up to Samori and met a fierce resistance which more than earned their respect. 13 major engagements. I'd like to quote one of the French officers in his statement about Samori. "It is not an exaggeration to say he showed himself superior to all the Negro chiefs. He was the one who gave proof of those characteristics of a chief, a strategist, a politician, an outstanding leader of men, possessing audacity, energy, the ability to follow up an advantage and plan in advance, and above all, a tenacity which could not be destroyed. Except, of course, that eventually it was destroyed. And Samari was captured in 1898, eventually, and exiled to Gabon, further down the West African coast, where he died 2 years later. He's considered to be a national hero in no less than 3 different modern West African countries. Now, turning to our Southern African example, in Lecture 16, we saw that the so-called Mfakane process resulted in the remaking of the Southern African ethnic map and the creation of powerful new kingdoms. One of these kingdoms was the Ndebele Kingdom, which was started by one of Shaka's lieutenants, Mzilikazi, who broke away from him and eventually moved his Zulu-style kingdom across the Limpopo and up into the southwestern portion of what is today Zimbabwe. This Ndebele Kingdom lay in the 1880s and 90s directly in the path of the plans being hatched by one of our old friends that we met in lecture number 18, and of course that is Cecil John Rhodes. At this point, Rhodes, of course, having made his fortune in diamonds and to some extent in gold, having served as Cape Prime Minister for a time, is turning his attention northward and devoting his resources to the colonization of the 2 countries, Northern Rhodesia and Southern Rhodesia, which would bear his name. He created the British South Africa Company, a chartered company given a special royal dispensation, an umbrella of royal power over it, in order to pursue the extension of the British Empire, which he devoutly and sincerely believed in, to extend that empire further north across the Limpopo from modern-day South Africa and into the Rhodesias. Well, let's take up then that tale of the second and last of the Ndebele kings, Mzilikazi's son, whose name was Lobengula. And he's a good example of the declining options available to African leaders at this point. Lobengula is an impressive figure. He weighed something like 250 to 280 pounds. The way he carried himself struck many visitors, Europeans included. One of them said, who had said he had seen, quote, many European and native potentates, said that with the exception of Tsar Alexander, never have I seen a ruler of men more imposing in appearance. Well, Lobengula is facing a situation in the 1880s as they approach the 1890s, again with declining options. He sought with limited success to play Afrikaners off against the British, the old game we've seen before. In 1888, he signed a treaty with Rhodes's representatives, hoping that a limited mining concession would buy off the advancing European pressure. It was not to be, and pressure increased, looming over him constantly. He finally said to a missionary who was serving as his advisor, and who was one of those, reluctant to say, unfortunate to say, who misled him on its terms. He thought this was going to be a straightforward mineral concession, not the thin end of the wedge towards colonial conquest. He said this to Helm once: "Did you ever see a chameleon catch a fly? The chameleon gets behind the fly and remains motionless for some time. Then he advances very slowly and gently, first putting forward one leg and then another. At last, when well within reach, he darts his tongue and the fly disappears. England is the chameleon, and I am that fly." Lobengula repudiated the concessions that he had made with Rhodes's agents directly to Queen Victoria, and for a time he was encouraged by her responses. But again, the shift in the direction is clear. By 1893, Rhodes's forces had occupied the portions of what is now Zimbabwe, lying to the east of Lobengula's kingdom, and the game was up. Lobengula's kingdom was invaded by Rhodes's forces, and Lobengula died sometime in 1893 on the run. 3 years later, a major uprising broke out against Rhodes's occupation in 1896 and 97, remembered by Zimbabweans today as the so-called first Shimaringa. Shimaringa, a word meaning struggle in that case. It was put down after 18 months, but this is the example I meant of a resistance, a rebellion, early in this case in the colonial period, or resistance, giving inspiration to the second Shimaringa, which would be the liberation war of the 1970s. The first Shimaringa was put down after 18 months and Rhodesia was secure. By 1900, these stories had been repeated with countless variations in almost every corner of Africa. Ethiopia was the great exception, as we saw in Lecture 9, where they were able to repel the Italian invasion, at least until Mussolini returned in the 1930s. Everywhere else, colonialism was born. Borders were redrawn, which reflected the accommodation between European rivals. That legacy, the colonial legacy, though gone in formal terms, is with us still. We need to take closer looks at it, as we will do in the next 2 lectures. Thank you.